We know a lot about the categorical proposition. We also know a lot about how to make inferences from one categorical proposition to another. We now move on to discussing the categorical syllogism. The categorical syllogism is a three-proposition argument, two premises, one conclusion. To the study of the categorical syllogism, you're going to bring to bear existing content knowledge and skills. You're also going to extend and deepen your knowledge and skill base by way of the Venn diagram and rules of the syllogism. You'll also learn about some mechanical and structural features of the syllogism that will allow you to become an expert at organizing and evaluating a syllogism for validity, as well as how you can deal with ordinary language arguments that aren't neatly within the structure of standard form for a categorical syllogism. Let's get started. So you already know what an argument is. You already know when an argument is valid, when an argument is invalid. You also already know in the system of categorical logic that we're dealing with four proposition types only. And we understand how to organize a sentence so that it reflects standard form for the categorical proposition. Now, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, we're moving on to study the categorical syllogism. We have a syllogism when we have a deductive argument, which is constructed entirely of categorical propositions with exactly two premises and a conclusion. Now, we'll see that there are other types of syllogisms that involve statements that are not categorical propositions, but we'll get to those in another chapter, chapter 8. So let's take a look at the example that you see on the screen in front of you. It begins with the sentence, "All comedians are shy people." So this categorical syllogism consists of two premises: all comedians are shy people, some comedians are good actors, and the conclusion, some good actors are shy people. Now, you might think about the fact that there are three categorical propositions in a categorical syllogism, and there are four statement or proposition types in categorical logic. That means that there are 256 permutations of the categorical syllogism. It will be really nice then to have some techniques that we can use in order to handily organize, and test a syllogism for validity. Okay, let's move on to some of the technical terms that you'll get used to as you work with them. Unless you are comfortable with memorizing, I would say don't worry about memorizing them. The more you use the terms as you're working with a syllogism, the more it will be the case that you just come to understand what the terms mean. Okay, so first, the subject of the conclusion is known as the minor term, and that will always be specified with a capital S. The predicate of the conclusion is called the major term. It's always designated or symbolized, designated by or symbolized with a capital P. And then the term that is repeated in the premises is called the middle term, and that gets designated or denoted by a capital M. So in the argument before us, all comedians are shy people, some comedians are good actors, so some good actors are shy people. We have good actors as the minor term, shy people as the major term, and comedians as the middle term. So, as with other arguments that you've confronted already, you want to identify first your conclusion, because that will tell you what your major and your minor terms are. Remember, not every argument is going to arrive already in what's known as standard form for the categorical syllogism. That's what this argument's in right now. So let's take a look at what the requirements are for a categorical syllogism. First, the three statements involved must be in standard form for the categorical proposition. In other words, all three of the statements need to have the quantifier that is in the relevant form, that is a universal all or a universal no, the quantifier some. You also need to have your statement reflect the relevant affirmative or negative. So if you have a universal negative, you use the word no. If you have a particular negative, you use the quantifier some and the copula are not. In addition, you want to make sure when you're putting your argument in standard form for the categorical syllogism that your major premise is first. Your major premise contains the major term. The major term is the predicate of the conclusion. Second is your minor premise. The minor premise contains the minor term. The minor term is the subject of the conclusion. So when you're looking at an argument that's not yet in standard form, you want to make sure that you identify the conclusion so that you can identify the minor and the major terms and then organize your argument accordingly. Now, this won't be important for you to do when you're dealing with Venn diagrams as a technique for testing an argument for validity, but it sure does help as a sort of standard practice to keep yourself organized. You will want to have your argument in standard form when you employ the rules of the syllogism as a technique for testing an argument for validity, since the rules refer to major and minor terms as well as the middle term. Let's start with using Venn diagrams to test an argument for validity on the modern interpretation of the universal. Now remember, when we're dealing with a single categorical proposition, we're dealing with a proposition that relates two classes of thing to each other. In other words, we have two circles, and the diagram, when we complete it, reflects those two circles' relations to each other. Another way to put this is that our Venn diagrams tell us visually what the logical structure of a given proposition is. Notice in a categorical syllogism, we have three classes of thing. Remember, we have the subject class in the conclusion, which is the minor term. We have the predicate class in the conclusion, which is the major term. And then we have the term that's repeated in the premises, the middle term. So take a look in the lower right corner and you'll see that there are three circles, each of which reflects one of the classes in the syllogism. So the numbering may help you as you're working. When we work face-to-face and we're working diagrams on the board, I'll write numbers so that I can ask class members what area needs to be diagrammed or left alone. So you may decide that you want to do that yourself, but just know that this is a way for you to organize your thinking about the areas of overlap and the areas where there is no overlap. I say that largely because lots of times people get a little bit overwhelmed. It feels like a lot of clutter, those areas of overlap. So the numbering can help you keep things straight. So let's now move on to the process of diagramming. First, when you are diagramming a categorical syllogism, you will always only diagram the premises. Moreover, when you are diagramming a syllogism that has at least one universal proposition, diagram the universal premise first. The reason why will become clear later. Suffice it to say, you want to eliminate those areas that can't have any X in them. So if you get those dealt with first, you won't need to go back into them later if you inadvertently diagrammed an X where in fact there can't be any X. So diagram your universals first. Lastly, you will always only diagram one premise at a time. In other words, take a look on the left side at the A proposition all PRM. So that would be, because it's all PRM, a major premise. Notice that area 6 is shaded. You might say, but wait a second, S is involved in that. You're shading S, but you're not supposed to. The sentence says all PRM. But remember, if you're if you're diagramming the sentence all PRM, you're diagramming the PM relationship as if the S isn't there. Same with the E proposition. No S or M. That's a minor premise. So take a look at the SM area of overlap. Notice that you shade areas 2 and 3 because you're saying in so shading that there can't be anything in the SM area overlap. The fact that a portion of the P circle is shaded is not relevant to the diagramming of that specific proposition. When you diagram particular propositions, you're going to get into potentially some trickiness. And what I mean by that is this. Take a look at the area of overlap designated by sections 3 and 4. Notice there is an X right on the line. The X right on the line designates that the sentence does not specify if the X that is a P and an M is also an S or not. So by putting the X on the line, you're saying the X may be in 4 but not in 3, or it may be in 3 but not in 4. This will be crucial depending on what the other premise is in determining the validity of the argument. Okay, so before moving on to this O proposition diagram, let me say a little bit more about the thought that I just left you with at the last slide, namely determining the validity of an argument. One of the really nice things about Venn diagrams is that they help you to focus on what a visually valid argument is. Now, I know that I shouldn't use that phrase visually valid, so let me try something else. When you diagram an argument that's valid, you show the validity when you diagram the premises. In other words, an argument that's valid is an argument whose conclusion appears or is made explicit when you diagram the premises. The conclusion is pregnant, if you will, in the premises, and it emerges, it becomes apparent when you diagram those premises. If, on the other hand, the argument is invalid, then your conclusion will not appear. It will either be obviously false or it will be possibly false. More on that in a little bit. For now, let's focus on the claim some S are not M. So what's the area where you want to put your X? You know what to do in an O proposition. An O proposition is diagrammed with an X in the area of S outside of M. But is the area of S outside of M inside or outside of the P overlap? In other words, does the X go in area 5 or area 6? Since the premise by itself doesn't tell us that, we put the X on the line. All right, let's try out our technique. Take a look at the top italicized argument in its original standard form and then abstracted to show its structure a little more clearly. The premises are: some designer drugs are addictive chemical substances. Some illegal drugs are not designer drugs. So, some illegal drugs are not addictive chemical substances. Notice that the subject of the conclusion, in this case, is illegal drugs, and that term has been replaced with a capital I, just to make the structure more clear. And then addictive chemical substances is the noun phrase that is the major term that's replaced with A. And then the middle term, designer drugs, is replaced with D. What is the mood and figure of this argument? Well, we have a particular affirmative, a particular negative, and a particular negative. That's IOO, figure 1. Check your chart to make sure that you see what I've just said. Now let's take a look at the diagram. Since there are no universal premises, it doesn't matter which premise we diagram first. Let's just go in order. So take a look at the DA overlap. Some D are A. The X goes on the line that crosses sections 3 and 4. That's because we don't know if the D that is an A is or is not also an I. Next, let's look at the minor premise. Some I are not D. The area that we want to diagram is area 5 and 6. That's because we're looking to put an X in the area that is in I outside of D. Notice, however, we don't know if the I that is outside of D is also outside of A, so we put the X on the line. Now, let's look at the conclusion. Remember, you always only diagram your premises. The conclusion says, some I are not A. Maybe, but maybe not. Look at that X that straddles the line between areas 5 and 6. If the X were in if the X were in area 5, the conclusion would be true. If the X were in area 6, the conclusion would be false. Since the conclusion could be true but could be false, the argument is invalid. Remember, an argument is valid when and only when, if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. Now let's take a look at another argument. This time we've got a different mood and figure. We have a particular affirmative, a universal affirmative, a particular affirmative, which means that our mood is I. The figure is 4. That's because the middle term, E, is in the predicate position and subject position of, respectively, the major and minor premises. Since we do have a universal premise in our argument, we're going to diagram the universal first. All E are L. That means that area 1 and area 4 are shaded. That tells us that whatever E's there may be, they're all dumped into the L category, namely, they'd all be in area 2 and 3. Next, some B are E. That's our major premise, but since it's a particular claim in an argument that includes a universal claim, we diagram it secondly. Some B are E. Notice where the X is. It's in area 3. Why? Because area 4 is unavailable. The area of overlap between B and E is the area where we must put an X in order to accurately reflect the claim some B are E. But notice that area 4 is not available. Shading designates that there is nowhere you can put anything. So the X must go into area 3. All right, we're done diagramming. Let's look at the conclusion. Some L are B. The area of overlap that reflects a true claim for this proposition is 3 or 6. And in fact, we have an X in area 3, so the argument is valid. Now remember the note that I put on the opening slide for Chapter 6, I mentioned that we would diagram on the universal interpretation and then immediately after the traditional. Then we would move on to the rules of the syllogism. It seems to me that that makes some sense since you're already thinking in terms of Venns. Okay, we know when we diagram a universal claim on the traditional interpretation of the universal, we assume a member of the subject class exists. So take a look at the left and the right diagrams. On the traditional interpretation, notice there's an X in the area of overlap between C and E and the area of overlap between T and E. In other words, there is an X in the area where the three circles intersect. That is reflective of the traditional interpretation. So the circled X just tells us that we're assuming a member of the subject class. Notice that in the right Venn diagram, there is no X for the same argument. Let's look at that argument. All C are E, all E are T, so some T are C. On the modern interpretation, this argument is invalid, and we'll see that it violates rule number 6. On the traditional interpretation, however, that's not the case. On the traditional interpretation, since we assume a member of the C class exists, we assume a member of the E class exists, it follows that some T are C. We'll see that when we get to the rules, that rule 6 is not violated. All right, so let's put this into practice, this being the traditional interpretation that assumes existential import for universal claims. So let's look at the modern interpretation of the argument, no V are C, all C are L, so some L are V. We can see that the argument is invalid. It's invalid because there is no X in the area of overlap between L and V. Now let's take a look at the traditional interpretation. No V are C tells us that the area of overlap between V and C is empty. In other words, you can't put anything there. But we do assume that there is at least one V, so there's an X on the line between the V area outside of and inside of the L category. Then we see all C are L, assumes a member of C exists, and there is an X in the LC overlap area because we've assumed a member of C exists. Nevertheless, the conclusion, some L are V, does not appear. Remember, the X that's on the the X that's on the line may or may not be in the area of overlap between L and V, or the area of overlap that reflects the LV relationship in the affirmative for a particular claim. So the argument is invalid. It's invalid on both the modern and the traditional interpretation. Next, we have mood and figure. Each argument can be structured, I should rephrase that. Each argument can be written in terms of its mood and its figure. The mood of the argument simply consists of the categorical proposition type involved. So when your argument is in standard form, you reflect the mood by way of the order of major premise, minor premise, and conclusions, categorical proposition type. Namely, the type is A, E, I, or O for each. So in the argument all P are M, all S are M, all S are P, you have three universal affirmatives, so the mood of the argument is A, A, A. The mood of the argument in the second example is EEO, and that's because the major premise is a universal negative, the minor premise is a universal negative, and the conclusion is a particular negative. If you're just given the mood and figure, you can discern how the argument lays out from those elements alone. So in order to complete this section, let's look at the figure of an argument. The figure has to do with the placement of the middle term in the premises. Notice that in figure 1, and your figures will always be 1, 2, 3, or 4 when they reflect the order of the middle term. In other words, these are the standards for figures 1, 2, 3, and 4. So figure 1 always reflects an argument whose middle terms are respectively in the subject position of the major premise and the predicate position of the minor premise. Figure 2 always reflects an argument whose middle term is in the predicate position of both the major and minor premises. And figure 3 reflects an argument whose middle term is in the subject position of the major and minor premises. Lastly, figure 4 reflects an argument whose middle term is always respectively in the predicate and subject positions for the major and the minor premises. Notice too that the letters S and P always reflect the minor and major terms. So the minor term is the subject of the conclusion. Notice that in figure 1 and 2, the minor term is also in the subject position of the minor premise. But in figures 3 and 4, the minor term is in the predicate position of the minor premise. Yeah, it feels like a lot to juggle, but you'll get used to it. Just know that S is the subject of the conclusion, and that letter S appears either in the subject position or the predicate position of the minor premise. The same goes for the major term. The major term appears in the major premise. The major premise is first in the order. In figures 1 and 3, the major premise, which is the predicate of the conclusion, appears in the predicate position of the major premise. But in figures 2 and 4, it appears in the subject position. So in terms of the categorical syllogism, the arrangement of subject and predicate positions have nothing to do with the grammatical subject or predicate in the relevant premises, namely major and minor premises. So going back to one of our examples, the mood was AAA, and you can see from the location of the middle term in the major and minor premises respectively that the figure is 1. This is a handy chart that will tell you which categorical syllogisms are valid under both interpretations. Remember, the modern and the traditional interpretation of the universal claim. So you can see, for example, that any argument with mood and figure AAA1 is valid on both interpretations. One of the things that's interesting about distinguishing between the modern and the traditional interpretation of the universal is it tells us what sorts of restricted inferences we can make, similarly to those inferences we can make around the square of opposition or by limitation on the traditional interpretation. So we move on to the second of our 2 techniques to test an argument for validity. The rules of the syllogism tell us whether or not an argument is valid. If your syllogism passes or satisfies each of the rules, so passes the test of rules 1 through 6, the argument is valid. But if your argument fails on a rule, it can be rule 1, it can be rule 6, it can be rule 3, it doesn't matter. The moment an argument fails to meet a rule or satisfy a rule, the argument is invalid. If you put the two techniques together, you have, as long as you follow the instructions for diagramming a syllogism using the Venn diagram technique or using the rules of the syllogism, you will have an infallible way of determining whether or not an argument is valid. Let's look at each of the rules in turn. Rule number 1 tells us that the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. It doesn't have to be distributed in both premises, but at least one. If the middle term is not distributed, the argument fails, and the fallacy is known as undistributed middle. Don't forget our distribution shorthand. When we're looking at individual propositions in a categorical syllogism, we're looking to see whether the subject class, regardless of whether we're talking about the major, the minor, or the middle term, is distributed or not. The same goes for the predicate class. Suppose you're looking at a syllogism in which the minor premise is a universal affirmative and you're looking at figure 4. That would say all M are S. So the universal affirmative in this case would distribute the middle term because the middle term occupies the subject position. On the other hand, because the minor term occupies the predicate position, it is not distributed. Rule number 2 tells us if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in its corresponding premise. Notice that we're not told a term has to be distributed in the conclusion, only that if it is, it must also be distributed in its corresponding premise. Rule number 3 tells us that you can't have two negative premises. Rule number 4 and rule number 5 tell us, respectively, that an argument with a negative premise must have a negative conclusion, and vice versa. Lastly, rule number 6 is the rule on which an argument fails on the modern interpretation if you have two universal premises and a particular conclusion. Remember the example you saw just a few minutes ago where an argument had two universal premises and a particular conclusion, and since the universal premises did not assume existential import, was the modern interpretation, the argument failed. In the particular scenario we looked at, the argument failed on the traditional interpretation as well, but that doesn't mean that it has to. So when you're thinking about the rules, again, you might think in terms of using the rules in combination with the Venn diagrams or vice versa. Just remember to keep straight the difference between the modern and the traditional interpretation of the universal. The only rule where there is a difference between the traditional and the modern interpretation is Rule 6. All right, let's go ahead and practice. All right, now consider that we're going to focus right now just on whether or not this argument meets and satisfies all the rules of the syllogism. Let's focus on the modern interpretation alone. So what do we have? We have the particular affirmative major premise. Figure 3 tells us that the middle term is in the subject position. So our major premise reads, sum M R P. The minor premise is a universal affirmative. Figure 3 tells us that the middle term is in the subject position. So our minor premise reads all M R S. And then the conclusion reads sum S R P. First, is the middle term distributed at least once? In the major premise, no terms are distributed. In the minor premise, the middle term is distributed, all M R S. So rule number 1 is satisfied. Rule number 2 reads, if the term if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must also be distributed in its corresponding premise. Remember, I propositions don't distribute either the subject class or the predicate class. So that means no term is distributed, so the rule doesn't apply. Move on to rule number 3. An argument can't have two negative premises. It does not. Both premises are affirmative. Rule number 3 is satisfied. That also means that rules 4 and 5 are satisfied. Remember, rules 4 and 5 say that if you have a negative premise, you must have a negative conclusion, and vice versa. Since both premises are affirmative, those two rules don't apply as well. Lastly, rule number 6 says if both premises are universal, the conclusion can't be particular. Well, one of our premises is universal, but only one. The other one is a particular. So, all 6 rules have been satisfied. The argument is valid. I hope this introduction to the categorical syllogism has helped you orient your thinking so that when you work on specific arguments, both in terms of identifying their features and evaluating them by one of the 2 methods of testing for validity, that you feel armed with the requisite tools to be successful.